GM, everyone. Might be a quick one, as it seems like we have a small group today, but primarily just wanted to give a quick timeline update and don't have too much else to add. Basically, hoping to propose the Silo v3 BIP that was shared earlier this week. Call it first half of next week, sometime like that, pending UI work. That's the main last step on that front. And last word from Halborn on the Bayesian integration audit is that it'll wrap up on the 17th of next month. So as soon as the Silo v3 UI is done, it'll be full steam ahead on the UI work for that BIP, such that it doesn't push back any timelines. So hopefully we can share and propose that BIP around that time, shortly after the Silo v3 BIP passes. Frankly, don't have too much else to share today, other than just wanted to have it on the record that I personally won't be taking any payment from Beanstalk Farms moving forward. I'm not going anywhere. The BFC is still a structure that exists to fund different work, so there are still devs and audits to pay for the rest of the year to implement a lot of the roadmap that I described last DAO meeting. Also would just shout out that to check out the Temp Check proposal that we shared under the town square in Discord. There's been a lot of good discussion about how many seeds to reward on the Bean ETH well, which is worthwhile discussion. So just wanted to shout that out as well, and then also mention lastly that on a related note to not taking payment, I also don't plan on attending these DAO meetings at a regular cadence anymore. If folks have questions and they want to drop them in the Barnyard chat, and there's a handful, and it seems like I'm the person best equipped to answer those questions, I'm happy to join, but I just don't plan on committing to joining these at a particular cadence. So that's really all I had to run through this week. Happy to pause and answer any questions, and otherwise this might be maybe a brief one, but always happy to answer questions. So we'll pause for a few moments.
Hey Guy, you just said a lot of really good discussion around the temp check. What do you make of all the discussion? Like, do you feel like we're kind of headed in a particular direction? It seems like there's been a lot of discussion. I feel like we're headed in a particular direction, but it's just hard to discern what the final outcome might be. And I didn't know if you had any particular thoughts.
Sure. So personally feel like one of the motivations for changing the LP token seeds is to reduce the cost of converting when below peg. That cost is the very impetus for all the discussion and the eventual inclusion in the Silo v3 BIP to set the unripe seed rewards to be equal, which does have a cost, to be clear. The cost being that when Beanstalk does grow, there's likely to be more upside volatility and excessive minting, which, may sound good on the surface, but is really not, and is the thing to avoid and be accounted for. This is all to say that perhaps it could, rather than decreasing the seeds for the LP token, rather than decreasing the seeds for the LP tokens, maybe it could make sense to increase the seed rewards for beans, which would have a similar effect. Feel like the point that was brought up around the fact that unripe depositors have been earning grown stock this entire over the better part of a year for not adding much value for keeping their assets in the system, and increasing the seeds per BDV for beans, potentially as well as LP tokens would be one way to sort of, shift where the pie is allocated, if you will, because all that matters at the end of the day is the stock ownership, not so much the number of stock. So yeah, I mean that's hot off the press. Haven't had a chance to think about it too much, to be frank, but those are a couple thoughts.
No, it's fair, and it's interesting. We've kind of gotten a chance to flesh out all the different angles of this this discussion, and I agree again, and how good that discussion has been, and it's a lot of competing. I don't know, priorities is the right word, but it seems like the right word, and I what I appreciate is that it doesn't seem like a lot of folks are just saying, well, what can we do to print the most? There does seem to be a really good discussion around like making sure that people are kept whole versus attracting new users like that. Like there's a robust discussion around good things, but it's been hard for me to discern where the discussion is leading at the moment. And I guess
even if you go ahead, Rex.
I was going to say my real fear is the thing that I mentioned in the chat was just that we end up being delayed because of lack of clarity, and regardless of the decision that's made. So that's what's on my mind.
Just to clarify, there are no plans to change what is being whitelisted from being ETH to some other asset like that. That is the thing that would change in any particular timeline. Changing the seeds post Silo v3 is fairly trivial.
Yep.
From a technical perspective. And yeah, I mean, I mentioned this in the channel, but maybe just to say it live here, perhaps some discussion around which liquid staking, which liquid staked ETH derivative, if any, would be appropriate to whitelist or not. Certainly worth talking about, but no plans to change the actual asset that's proposed to be whitelisted in the Bayesian integration BIP. Which is great.
Admittedly, I'll speaking personally, I think that's definitely the right option. So that's easy. I'm thinking through this, syncs discussion around seed rewards and just making sure that we're aligned. And your point about it being relatively trivial to change the seed rewards, that's helpful to me because that was probably the biggest thing on my mind is just us essentially taking too long to come to consensus and running into a delay because of it. So that's good to know.
I had one other thing I was going to add. I'm trying to remember. It was just that although it will be very straightforward to whitelist, new wells in the silo after Bayesian is deployed, from my perspective, don't think that means that the discussion around which assets are appropriate with regards to liquidity, censorship resistance, et cetera, should have any less gravity. So, this is all to say that I don't think it's necessarily appropriate to get trigger happy, if you will, but at least from a development perspective, it is much more straightforward now. Outside of just considering what asset to whitelist, there is, of course, research that would need to be done in how the well derives the price of the asset that's trading against the beans, i.e. the Oracle. Just in my experience over the last few weeks, it's there's not too many great options on Ethereum. So just wanted to toss that little nugget out there for people to nibble on as they think about what assets may make sense to whitelist versus not.
Is there a place, Guy, for some type of document that provides that guidance? Because I can see that being a question in the future is, okay, we've got these list of things that are important. what's on the list, what might we not have thought of, etc.
No formal list. I mean, I don't know how long the list is really, other than like the assets level of decentralization, liquidity, and then the options for its oracles. But
All right, that's fair.
don't quote me on that. Just thinking out loud. But yeah, I mean it's a good shout.
That's fair.
I guess potentially stability would be another factor.
Yeah, I guess what's going through my mind is, are there any components that wouldn't come up through an organic discussion by the community? And if the list is short and they're things that are usually pretty easy to, recognize, then I suppose it would probably happen organically.
Yeah, I mean, just the one I would highlight that I just mentioned is the oracles for getting the price of the non-bean asset, which is not obvious. Was spending some time looking at options for LUSD, and it's extremely limited, frankly. I think there was either a Uniswap V2 or V3 pool that had less than 8 figures of liquidity. There was a curve pool that was paired against 3 curve that is exposed to all the centralization risks of 3 curve. And then there's a Chainlink feed that is not secured by link staking. So would just shout out, that this Oracle access is something to consider, because it's like LUSD is is the stable coin that comes to mind when people talk about decentralization. But if you can't get the price of LUSD in a manipulation resistant fashion, it makes it tough. So just to provide an example.
Sorry, Guy, I may have lost you a bit here. Are you saying that Chainlink can be manipulated and this is your concern?
Just in the case of the LUSD price feed, it is not secured by staking. And so the parties that report the price have nothing to lose by reporting the wrong price. It's just the honor system. So it's only manipulable to the extent that, the parties reporting the price report it incorrectly. But I just shout out that it's not secured by staking to say that, it's just an honor system basically, which is not pretty.
That's a good call.
But it's an option. It is an oracle.
Do we know, or is there actually any case or example of a Chainlink oracle that had or went through something similar to that, where there was some sort of manipulation risk, or it got manipulated?
Like, you're saying the parties reporting the price, like, colluded to report the wrong price, or sorry, maybe I'm not understanding the question exactly.
Yes. So the concern that you just highlighted, is it in theory, or did that happen in practice, or there was an example of such a risk?
It's a great question. I don't know of specific examples off the top of my head. But it's certainly possible in theory. That's a good question, though.
Yeah, just to go back one more time. For now, only whitelisted well is going to be the Bean ETH well, correct?
All I'm saying is that is the proposal in the Bayesian integration BIP, of which the audit completes in the next couple weeks.
Yep, sounds good. Just triple checking. So I know that we're in the irrigation team, we're talking about how that might integrate with that project, and knowing what those tools are going to be is important. Beneath is pretty critical. So
Amazing. Alrighty. Anyone else have any questions?
Yeah, I just want to touch on something you said earlier, that you're not going to be attending these calls anymore. First, why is that? And second, what's going to happen to these calls if you don't attend, right? Like if Beanstalk Farms leadership isn't attending these calls, what is the expectation, both, I guess, from you, and also this question is to the rest of the DAO members that are here on this call or listening to the recording. What do you guys expect to see happening on these calls, or once they stop, right? Or if Beanstalk Farms leadership isn't attending?
I guess I can answer first. What do I expect to happen? I'm not sure. I mean, I would encourage folks to self-organize and discuss things that are happening. You know, I know Rex mentioned to me the potential of irrigation, wanting to propose a couple different things to the DAO. You know, we'll defer to him on what details he wants to discuss. I feel like that would be a great example of something that someone would want to come to the DAO meeting to present and talk about. If not for the fact of just having it on the recording. You had some other questions. I'm trying to remember.
Well, how is it useful if a bunch of DAO members get together to discuss ideas, but the people that are officially in charge of Beanstalk, the Beanstalk Farm organization, are not at that table, are not at that conversation?
Well, just to be clear, myself and no one is officially in charge of Beanstalk, but
right.
I
But
mean,
you see how that's
why,
like
what are you asking? I want to try to answer.
Yeah, I guess what I'm touching on is like there's been I guess ever since I've been here, I've been hearing Publius constantly beat this drum of he's not the lead, he's just the guy. They made the thing originally, but now they don't want to be leads. Anyone can come in, propose things. And this has been the message from Publius. This is kind of the message that Beanstalk Farm has kind of subtly been trying to push out. This is what you're saying now as well, that you don't feel like Beanstalk Farms is in charge of the DAO in any way. And while that technically might be true, or it might be true in certain phrasing and definitions of what a DAO is and all that stuff, the fact of the matter is that that's just like a semantic game, because the truth is Beanstalk Farms is in charge, right? All these proposals are to convince Beanstalk Farms to do things or not to do things. Beanstalk Farms is the actor that acts on behalf of the DAO. Beanstalk Farms, as far as I understand, was elected by the DAO to execute the DAO's will. So for the leads of Beanstalk Farms, which I suppose it's you mostly now, or you're the front man, right? To say that you guys aren't in charge, or Beanstalk Farms isn't in charge of anything, and you're gonna stop attending meetings and all this stuff, to me, I don't get it. It just feels like there's no leadership in this DAO, or it feels like the leads are walking away, frankly. And this is also further amplified by the recent actions of what genuinely feels like winding down of Beanstalk. And the fact, specifically with the fact that we've cut employee pay, we've let go a couple people, we haven't proposed a budget. And the message in that post, or the message in that message that you're is that in a couple of months maybe things are going to go private future Beanstalk development is going to be privatized or not, but it sure seems like everything's looking like a wind down. I mean, it really does, right? Like, so is this a correct characterization? Is this what the DAO understands other than myself? Am I just looking at this wrong? Do the rest of people understand that this was happening? And please correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm mischaracterizing anything here, because I don't want to like say things that are incorrect. But to me, it feels like something major is happening and it's not the most important thing being discussed. To me, it feels like the most important thing. And it seems like no one else is kind of either aware of it or if they're aware of it, maybe it's not having as much of an impact as it is to me. And I guess I'm curious why that is. Maybe I don't get it or they don't get it.
So not to jump in front of you guys, but I guess Al, my question for you would be like, what's your expectation around what a group like Beanstalk Farms would do long term? Is it, continue to build out features for the protocol, or to just ensure it as, to use the term, an ongoing concern? Like, what would your expectations for that be?
Okay, so let's just pretend this is like a normal company, right, with a product, because in many ways we can make that parallel. Beanstalk is a product, and Beanstalk Farms is the company that runs that product. And the way I would kind of like take the analogy further is that the DAO is sort of like the board members that elects people to run the company. In other words, Beanstalk DAO has elected Beanstalk Farms to basically carry out the day-to-day operations and trusts a lot of decision-making to Beanstalk Farms. But at any point, the DAO has the capability to put up for a vote and override any decision made by the Beanstalk Farms, right? So to me, the DAO is the ultimate owner, but the DAO is decentralized. There's no one person that can make a decision. And you need an executor. You need an entity that can, an entity that can basically execute the will of the people, meaning practically like own, GitHub accounts, DNS names, being able to push things, have access to the multi-sig, although whatever. But all of those actions need to be performed by some entity, right? As well as, to some degree, some decision-making process. Like the really big decisions get voted on through proposals, but then there's other decisions that are pretty big, but they get made internally, right? Product decisions and a lot of decisions get made internally in Beanstalk Farms. So going forward, I guess my expectation is who's going to be doing that? If, what does the DAO expect to happen to the app, to the product, without a central leadership organization, like without some kind of leadership or team to do things?
So I guess what runs through. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I guess what runs through my mind first would be that it might be more accurate, and maybe this is just the way that I look at it. When I think of Beanstalk protocol, I think of an economy rather than a company. And that's, again, that might just be my point of view. Maybe other people don't share that. And that takes the role that Beanstalk Farms plays, and it changes it a little bit. Because, Al, I agree. If you're looking at Beanstalk Protocol as a company, and Beanstalk Farms is like, its operations team or its product development team or whatever, I think your frame of reference or your expectations are probably correct. But I think if you change your frame of reference to thinking of Beanstalk as an economy, then it takes Beanstalk Farms in turns it into a company acting within the economy. And then, so to your point about like the DNS stuff and like that kind of daily, how does it run? I don't want to speak for Guy, but I'm under the impression based on prior conversations and announcements that like those functions are still going to exist. Like I hate to use the word custodial, but they're like, it's kind of a custodial function, like, making sure the lights stay on. And those functions are still going to exist as I understand it, because they would have to. And then, so if you take that stuff and kind of put it in that custodial basket, and then you look at the other group of stuff, which is like product development, new initiatives, etc., I think that's where other organizations are going to step in. And in this case, I'm going to speak on behalf of irrigation. Like I know that irrigation and Veros and other groups are looking at taking on those responsibilities and saying, okay, what's next? What do we build on top of this economy? So if you look at it from that point of reference, I think that's why a lot of folks are not as up in arms about it. Like to me, when I look at this, I say, okay, it looks like we're solidifying for the long haul. If there needs to be some major change to the protocol, then it's probably going to be important enough where people are going to rally around it. And in the meantime, there are enough folks now that have pretty vested interest in seeing Beanstalk succeed long term that there are folks that are working on new products and new initiatives and opportunities. So as long as the lights stay on, product development can move outward. And so, it sounds like those custodial functions are covered. Product development is covered. It's just going to look different than how it was. So that's just my opinion, but I think it's probably relatively accurate.
Yeah. So, what you said about the frame of reference being an economy versus a company, right? First of all, those two things don't have to be exclusive, right? Beanstalk, the application, Bean.money is the product, and it can have an economy around it, right? Whether or not an economy grows around the product that we're building here is neither here nor there. Let's change gears for a second, right? Curve is a product, but it also has an economy where tons of other things have been built on top of Curve, right? So we can make the parallel to Curve pretty easily. In fact, we can probably make the parallel to a lot of other DAOs out there, but let's just stick with Curve, right? But Curve still has a team. They still have a product. They still have what looks like a company, basically, right? And they still make decisions. So I don't think the fact that we're thinking in an economy mindset should change how we've been operating. This is what I don't get. For the last 2 years, Beanstalk Farm has operated in this way, as if like, hey, we're building this product that will hopefully launch an economy. But if other people want to do stuff in this economy, great, good for them. Go do it. We're here to enable you. We're here to help you. We've built SDKs. We're open. We can help. We can collaborate. Great. But my question is, why does that have to change? Or how does that change? Or why is that changing how Beanstalk Farms operates and the role of Beanstalk Farms within this DAO? And I think the answer that I'm hearing is that everyone kind of expects that Beanstalk Farms and Beanstalk the app, so app.bean.money, is kind of done. This is kind of like the vague message that I'm kind of hearing from the community and some other people, is that people think like, hey, we're done. We've built everything we need to build. Now we're just going to keep it in maintenance mode. And maybe if something big comes up, we'll figure it out. But like the main features are done, we're there. And to me, that, I don't know, to me, that seems like nonsense, right? Like we've been building like crazy for the last year that I've been here. People have been building on this thing for more than I've been here for the last 2 years. We've been going at like 200 miles an hour. And all of a sudden we're going to hit this milestone and we're going to be like, okay, we're done. Everything's off the checklist. The roadmap is fully complete. Any new things can be spun off by third parties. And I feel like that's a huge risk, because to enact that, well, you're getting rid of your talent, right? Like we've lost developers, we've lost some very high talent, right? People are winding down. And when the time comes to like fix something or do something or build something else, and it will. I mean, it's crazy to suggest that app.bean money, whether it's the contracts or the UI, won't ever need like some big changes. Sorry, am I still here? Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, you're still here. You're good.
That won't happen. And when that time comes, it's going to be hard to find the correct talent that is senior enough to do the work, and more importantly, has the context of how all the stuff that has been built actually works. Because it's very complex under the hood, and it's not like you can just find a senior developer and they can just hit the ground running. So there's risks in winding things down and just assuming that any new development is going to be done by these private companies. Because those private companies, they're going to have their own private motivations and private things going on. So if the DAO all of a sudden wants something to happen, well, if that desire isn't in line with these private companies' roadmaps, then what?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's a fair point. And I guess the thought that goes through my mind is there may be a place for the DAO to have some type of function or mechanism where problems can be quickly identified. Because, yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. In the case of a real issue where we would need to spin up some type of technical support, you know, the worst part about being in those situations is the speed required a lot of times to navigate. And I think there's a place for, you know, the DAO to be thinking about how we can do that in an effective way. But you know, I don't know, and it may just be a difference in point of view. But
Well,
go ahead.
Albin, respectfully, it feels like we're fixating a little bit too much on the UI, which I would totally agree with you that that's not. It's difficult. It'd be difficult to call that, you know, done or close to done. If we take a look at the contracts, I guess I would be interested to know, after the upgrades I described at the last DAO meeting, what you feel is what additional upgrades to Beanstalk aren't just marginal after that, at least in Beanstalk's current state, you know, where it lives in the EVM. And the reason I ask is because, you know, I'm sure we're on the same page that just doing work for the sake of doing work is not value added. We want to do the high leverage work. And so the question is, you know, what is the list of the highest leverage Beanstalk upgrades left to implement that would put Beanstalk, the piece of software that runs on Ethereum, nothing else, not the UI, not anything else, just the contracts. What is the short list of upgrades that would put Beanstalk in a position to be very successful for the medium term, call it a couple years to a few years, and feel pretty good about the list described at the last DAO meeting, that once those are implemented, the contracts really wouldn't need to change all that much, again, in where they currently live on Ethereum. And, you know, there's a whole, you know, rabbit hole that, you know, to get into around what it looks like for what the future of Beanstalk looks like after that. But genuinely feel like at the contract level that not much would need to change after that point. And to be clear, that is not what I'm describing is not Mayflower. It's the set of 4, 5, 6 things I described at the last DAO meeting that are not going to be done next month. It is going to take time, and from that perspective, nothing is going to change substantially, in the next 6 to 8 months, in my view. So I know you brought up a lot, but hopefully that helps address some surface area of it.
I can answer that question, right? So you're asking me like, what else is on the roadmap that we need to do stuff? Like, why do we need a team if there's no roadmap, right? And
I'm not asking why we need a team, why we don't need a team. I'm just curious at the contract level, what do you feel would be the very high leverage upgrades?
Right. So I don't have a list, right? I don't have an answer to that because I have not been involved in creating roadmaps in these discussions. But I would point out that over the last 2 years, we've had a constant stream of upgrades and updates and improvements and new features that we've been doing. And to suggest that now, all of a sudden, we've hit the holy grail and everything's peachy seems odd, to say the least. But more importantly, I feel like the conversations around how do we improve things have stopped. And they've stopped months ago when Publius decided to stop attending these calls and being involved. Because a lot of those improvements were stemmed from these discussions that we used to have that were amazing, where Publius was involved in discussing various economic topics with DAO members. And what spawned out of those conversations were roadmap items that we've been working on. So Publius stopped attending and these conversations stopped happening. And of course, now we don't have any more ideas to implement. So it's very easy to say, well, we're about to finish everything that's on our roadmap. What else is there? Well, sure, there's nothing else because no one's talking about anything else. And if we're okay with that, then we're okay with that. But it just feels like some of the stuff. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, you guys mind if I chip in here? I haven't attended these very much, but I do listen to the Spotify recordings. I feel like, because I've been involved with Beanstalk for maybe like a year or so, I feel like generally there's a very high degree of focus since Publius left on like immutability and centralization. Like we were talking about it, the oracles earlier. We talked about, I think in the last DAO meeting, about the multi-sig and this sort of different ways we could fork and upgrade without sacrificing immutability. I'm not sure. I think the DAO sort of has to make a decision as to whether they want to go down a path of like LUSD, where it's fully immutable, and like that's a core value prop, and that makes the protocol very attractive to the institutions and the users and the retail people that use LUSD and other immutable protocols. Or if we want to be more centralized, right, with a clear path to being immutable and decentralized. I don't know if that's after these upgrades or if it's in a couple of years or if it's in 10 years. But I think generally the DAO has to make a decision as to whether the core focus should be on getting to immutability as soon as possible, or if it should be around bootstrapping utility and economic activity, sort of like we were talking about with Curve, where there's probably a good amount of work to be done on like a non-technical basis, right, like BD, but will probably result in changes in the contracts that are maybe not very large, but probably wouldn't make sense to like create a whole new system or fork it. Yeah, I think I don't know why everyone's leaving internally, but generally I think there is risk to becoming immutable and fully decentralized too early. especially with something like Beanstalk where there is no collateral backing, right? So it's a credit system and people have to, repayment is based on future demand coming to Beans. So if that future demand doesn't exist, which is most likely a function of utility, then the whole protocol fails. So I think there is risk, unlike LUSD, there is risk here to becoming immutable too quickly and not bootstrapping utility because, yeah, I mean, I can go on, but I think generally there needs to be consensus over sort of what the roadmap looks like in terms of immutability versus focusing on like product, right, and iterating, and it's probably more centralized, but that's the risk we're taking today with the goal of eventually being decentralized.
Yeah, Casper, I hear that. And I think where the conversation is leading is the idea of making Beanstalk immutable and solidified, and then having other parties come in that are more centralized themselves and build on top. And I agree with you. I was thinking of LUSD when we were talking earlier with Al, and like that's the best example of immutability. And like there aren't a lot of people that are like there's no LUSD roadmap that I know of. Maybe there is, but like that is I feel like that is a goal that Beanstalk has established and is working towards, and then saying, okay, external parties come in and bring that utility with the work that you're doing in a more centralized fashion.
I see that, but
I guess maybe quickly, Casper, one, agree there's definitely risk of becoming immutable too quickly. Two, feel like the dichotomy you draw between immutability versus focusing on utility feels a little bit vague and fuzzy, and we'd be interested in hearing what you think that means, particularly as you mentioned BD work requiring contract level upgrades, like protocol level upgrades, and what that, if you have like examples that you'd be interested in sharing or can think of on that front, on the front of people leaving. I'm not going anywhere and still spend, I can only speak for myself, but I'm not going anywhere and still spend nearly every waking moment thinking about Beanstalk, but primarily would be interested in hearing what that means to you in terms of what it means to focus on quote unquote product or utility and the development that is required related to that.
yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult, sort of like Albin was saying, like it's difficult to forecast what changes will need to be made. But just generally, like even in Web 2, product, if you treat this sort of like a startup, right, there's going to be a lot of different iterations of product. And I don't think that Beanstalk in its current state from a contract perspective is going to cut it in terms of getting to the end goal. I think there's a lot of work that'll need to be done that unfortunately I can't really support with actual contextual info on like what the upgrades would be and what would need to change. But there's, I can almost say for certain that you can't just let the system go at this point and then expect there to be utility. There can be like centralized BD units on top, let's say. And I think that's a good start. But if there's no sort of flexibility or ability to make changes at the contract level, I think it just makes the BD work way more difficult because we don't necessarily know what those upgrades will be. And it will limit the BD side if we can't make changes to the contract side. So I think something to think about is like, what is the risk of it not being immutable today, right? And like being more centralized. Because, it's, in my opinion, a big risk to sort of let the system go at this point. like we're going to make this beneath well, and that'll enable like zero fee trading and things like that. But like who are the takers of that pool? Like who's going to be using that product? And sort of, I'm sure there's going to be external features at the contract level that we're going to have to build out to continue to find product market fit around that beneath well or other sort of whitelisted pools that come into that DEX. Like I'm not going to have discrete updates that we're going to have to make, obviously, and I don't think that's the right way to look at it when you're thinking about, does it make sense to be immutable or not? I think the question is like, what is the risk to us not being immutable today, right? There's still probably going to be sufficient demand. If we can route trades at zero fees, that should be enough of an incentive from an economic perspective for people to use the protocol, especially if you're just routing trades through it, right? You're not actually like, if you're not an LP, you might not be taking custody, or you might not be actually taking risk in terms of the centralization risk associated with LPing in that pool. So I don't see more, like a lot of these decisions aren't really black and white, right? It's like, there's like trade-offs. I just don't see the massive downside risk that would warrant us to become immutable and inherently limit the protocol, right? Limit the BD work, limit the ability to iterate on product and find utility. I think it's just a big risk, especially when we're under peg and people sort of are losing confidence. Like I think these are the moments where if we can find, and maybe I know there's not really BD effort right now, and I think that might be the biggest hole in the protocol, but I just think it's something we should consider, and it's not black and white, it's like trade-offs. So we have to think about the risks associated with becoming more immutable and not being able to change anything with the contracts, right? And if the beneath well and the silo and the way everything works right now and maybe a gauge system is enough, then I'm fine with that. But I personally don't think it's enough if, according to my sort of long-term view of what Beanstalk could and should become at scale.
Yeah,
Totally. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say I totally agree with what Casper said, and I fear like the big question that always comes up is, well, what do we do? Like, what's the alternative? What do we build, right? And this comes back to this question of like leadership and vision, which is something that I think Beanstalk is lacking right now. Ever since Publius decided to leave or take a back step or whatever we want to call it, we don't have a mechanism to like really push the envelope, right? We don't have good product leadership right now. That's why everyone's asking the questions, well, what else is there to build? Well, we don't know because we don't have a visionary leader that can like look at the spectrum in DeFi and look at the economics out there and look at the whole ecosystem here and just like deduce like what the next chess moves are. That's missing at Beanstalk, I think. And to Casper's point, focusing on decentralization and some of these other things, which, yeah, you could say that there's value there, there's risks of being centralized, and we should move the needle more towards those. In my opinion, those aren't priority right now, right? Like Beanstalk's in a bit of a hole. Focusing on decentralization and immutability are like putting the cart before the horse. We need to resurrect this thing. We need to make it popular. We need to make it big, and then we can focus on these other things, in my opinion.
Maybe it is just a general sentiment internally, because there's not really that sort of vision / BD, part of the conversation. Because immutability ultimately is like a security thing, right? So if we have hundreds of billions of dollars of volume going through Bean, then it makes sense to focus on security. But if it's just a bunch of degens trying to figure out, how to build a system that would work at scale, when it's not at scale, that seems less practical. It also just doesn't seem like it would probably survive. given the structure of Beanstalk. Again, I think LUSD could survive given its structure. I don't know if it's going to get to scale. That's a whole nother thing. But just from a protocol perspective, right? Like the way the protocol is set up in terms of incentives and collateral and things like that. I don't know. There could be like a slight bias internally because most of the team is engineering. I'm not actually really sure how the team is structured, but yeah, perhaps maybe we need to do more BD. Like that seems like maybe it's a missing hole, and that would get more of that sort of like visionary type conversations happening internally, and also show that there is a real need to have upgradability at a contract level, and there's probably less of a need to have immutability. I don't know why people are leaving the team. Maybe there's something we don't know, but I have, I don't know, Guy, if you have thoughts on why Publius has left. I know people always ask this, but like, I have one. I'll address an elephant in the room. I think there has been more of a regulatory crackdown in the US. And if there is a part of the team or contributors or whatever that live in the United States, right there is a risk, right? Like there's true risk there. And so that could be a real reason why Publius, I'll just address the elephant in the room. Publius might have left because there is that regulatory angle now. So that is a real risk. And I don't think we should downplay that. But I also don't think we should just ignore it and be, not transparent about why people don't want to be involved in the DAO or on the team, like the core team, like Beanstalk Farms.
I can answer to why some people have left. I mean, just hearsay and just anecdotal. It's mainly A, they were let go, B, salaries were cut, and C, disagreement with the direction of Beanstalk Farm leadership. Specifically, not just leadership, but like specifically this decision to kind of wind it down and go private.
Casper, did you have a question for me? I wanted to make sure I didn't miss it. If so.
I would hope that you also don't know why Publius has left, and that's not an opaque, sort of non-transparent part of the conversation. So yeah, I guess my question is like, do you know? And if you don't, like, do you know anyone else that knows why Publius has left?
Well, I guess I would start by refuting the premise of the question. I mean, I talk to Publius several times a week about Beanstalk.
I mean, I'll push back on that. Just because you talk to him in private doesn't mean he's still around, right? Clearly,
okay. So by leaving, by left, are you guys just referring to like DAO meeting attendance primarily?
I mean, it's a pretty simple question. We don't have to get technical. I don't know why we need to get so technical in the definition of leaving, but specifically,
I just want to answer. I want to answer your question properly. I want to give it the respect it deserves.
But I feel like the spirit of the question is easily understood, right? He hasn't been around in the chats. He hasn't been attending DAO meetings, and internally, in the private Beanstalk Farm channels, I haven't seen him around. He hasn't attended the internal calls. He hasn't been involved in internal conversations as well. So that's what is meant by leaving.
Great. So just referring to the general concept of not being present in the Discord, sure. I mean, there are multiple Publius, and I'm gonna do my best not to speak for anyone, obviously, but I feel like the message they'd sent in April around the quality of discussion and how time is best spent developing Beanstalk. You know, you referred to some of the public discussion calls that we had held earlier this year, I believe, like the dev calls, where you had mentioned we had figured out a few roadmap items. You know, personally, didn't get a lot out of those as far as direction in terms of, you know, they did feel like more like, you know, presentations that time needed to be spent preparing for, rather than, you know, discussions where, you know, there was a lot of valuable input from, you know, from several different sides. And so, I mean, that was one of the reasons that we discontinued those. I mean, as far as the DAO meeting goes,
When I made that comment, by the way, just to clarify.
sorry, can you say that again?
Sorry, I wasn't talking or referring about the dev calls when I made that comment.
Apologies. Yeah, I mean, I don't really speculate it, don't attend the meetings on their behalf. If that's the, you know, primary concern.
Hi, everyone. I wasn't able to be here at the beginning of the call, so I don't know if you've already spoken about this, but there's a certain matchup in the questions on the sort of public non-presence of the Publius and the decision as well to push for the protocol to move towards immutability. Both of those situations seem to be betting on the solution of sort of immutability and contributions by every individual DAO member to move the project forward. Not to say at all that the Publius aren't busy building. From what I understand, they're continuously putting more and more GitHub comments and adding code constantly. But if that's the case, then it would seem that the way forward is for everyone to contribute to building, stacking things on top of Bean in their own way. And if we succeed at that, hopefully at some point in the near future, it will be possible to make Beanstalk immutable without having to take on the current risks that would involve. Low morale, not so much usage, etc. But if we could get Beanstalk into a different place before making it immutable, then that might be a winning strategy.
Well, I certainly don't disagree with anything you said in particular, Schizobra. Would just add that, you know, there seems to be this undertone of people feeling like it's the primary motivation is like offloading responsibility. And to me, that's not what it's about at all. In the list of upgrades that I described at the last DAO meeting, immutability is one, and, you know, it logically follows that it would be the last of the upgrades I described. And in my opinion, it's clear the value add of the upgrades that would precede any removal of governance, that the list is still being worked on, but for the most part includes all the upgrades to Beanstalk that aren't marginal improvements. And, you know, it doesn't really feel like an appropriate response to what other changes would be necessary to include before removing governance. That it's like we don't have enough leadership or vision. I would just implore you to critic first principles about which upgrades are important to include and which ones move the needle and which ones are necessary for Beanstalk. And if there were ever to be a time where governance is removed, then it would be necessary to implement all of those things before then. So I spent a lot of money what that list is. I'm here asking people to think about what should be on that list as well. But certainly don't feel like the answer is, you know, we're out of ideas, so we're screwed. I mean, frankly, have never been more optimistic about the future state of Beanstalk. And go ahead, Scott.
Sorry, Guy. I just wanted to add that I agree entirely with you, and I didn't want to give the impression of claiming that it's an abdication of responsibility in any way. My impression is just that seems to be the way the group is responding. So the group is saying something like, where is the king? Where's the father? And when that happens in groups, it's a fairly it's a fairly common phenomenon. And usually the solution is just to get back and make little work groups and start adding on. And as you're saying, to brainstorm on all the different ways that we could improve Beanstalk and build on top of it, that's the key. At least that's what we're doing at Irrigation at the moment. We're trying to look for any different component we could add to the Beanstalk ecosystem that would make it smoother, improve, offer more features, etc. And something wonderful about that is it gives a kind of optimism, and it removes the concern or any worry someone might have about Beanstalk price or Beanstalk coming back or when comments in the Discord, etc. And I wholeheartedly recommend that solution for everyone, because I believe you'll notice that the morale of the group changes dramatically as everyone gets to work.
Would just
Sorry,
go
but I have to
a little
disagree
bit further to,
and offer.
please.
Sorry, I was just
Sorry.
going to offer an opposing point of view there, that it's easy to have this mentality that, yeah, we can just break off into little groups and people could just add on to the protocol and everything be great. But first of all, that can happen anyway and has been happening. Proof of the matter being that there's a couple of companies building on top of Beanstalk as we speak. So irrespective, that's happening anyway, right? What we're talking about is Beanstalk itself, not what other third parties choose to build on top of it. So to go back to my curve analogy, right? The curve team didn't necessarily disband, shut down governance, lock the protocol up so they can go off and build Convex and build Vodium and build whatever, all these other things. There's still a core company or team that is responsible for curve, and they're still innovating in that space and maintaining and innovating and pushing the envelope, despite the fact that there's, like you said, using the same words, different groups building on top of it, those being different DAOs. So like, it's a very important distinction to make here, because we don't have to disband this team and this DAO, well, not the DAO, but this team in order for other companies to start and build on top of Beanstalk, right? Unless the decision is, hey, we no longer want to innovate on Beanstalk, we'll take the innovation and privatize it all. And if that's what we're saying, then that's what we're saying. But let's just be clear with that.
Can't speak for the Beanstalk team, but my understanding is that the movement is gently in that direction, to have built sort of the underlying fundamental structure of the Beanstalk ecosystem, to add on all the essential features that are understood to be completely necessary, and then to begin incentivizing third parties to build on top of it. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that's the general push of strategy at the moment. And of course, both of the solutions could work quite well. As you mentioned, the Curve structure, it's phenomenal, and Curve continues to be a monumental player in DeFi space. And I guess the counterexample would be Tornado Cash, where they did have a few modifiable aspects of the protocol, and they had some governance aspects, but I believe the core portion of the protocol was immutable for, generally speaking, protection reasons, for legal reasons. And so eventually that may be the end goal of the fundamental core of Beanstalk, to have it become some sort of unchangeable aspect of the DeFi ecosystem, much like Tornado Cash. My 2 cents is that if that is the case, we just make sure to optimize it as much as possible before doing that.
Hey guys, I'm hearing a bit or some more talk on the immutable, or the idea of making Beanstalk immutable. I'm not sure exactly what the plan is there. How are we thinking of doing that or achieving that?
Well,
Maybe rephrase. Is there something I'm unaware of?
No worries. The TLDR is at the last DAO meeting, talked about a list of 5 or 6 upgrades that we hope to work on over the coming, for the rest of the year, and have that list be as complete as possible as far as the things that really move the needle, and leaving, marginal improvements out, and potentially removing governance after that. I don't think this is what you're asking about, but just to say it anyway, implementation-wise, it'd be very simple. The BCM would just transfer ownership to the null address. But
and just to confirm, sorry, my question was going to be the seed gauge. With regards to the seed gauge, how are we going to do this without governance?
that would be implemented by then.
But there will still be a way for people to vote for the seed gauge, correct? Or will that run?
No, so the current thinking around the seed gauge system is to have it fluctuate totally autonomously based on, any on-chain values theoretically, but primarily the liquidity to supply ratio seems like a good one, such that the ratio between the seeds rewarded to LP tokens versus beans fluctuates in response to that. So if liquidity is high but debt is high, for example, Beanstalk should be more willing to reward converters than sowers, for example. It's still TBD basically, but the long and the short of it is that it would be autonomous.
And then non-upgradable. So whatever logic is, the idea to implement, the logic, as you said, which adjusts the seeds and so on, then that's not upgradable anymore. And the answer is yes.
If governance were to be removed, yes, that would be the state of affairs. And on a related note, again, I mentioned this in the last DAO meeting, but happy to talk about it, which is that it seems like the list of, potential assets that are compelling to whitelist is pretty short, really. So it doesn't seem like, in the short to medium term, there needs to be a way to, to react to changes in missions if it's just, for example, ETH and a couple different stable coins. Just to be clear, I'm firing at the hip when I give those examples as far as what should be whitelisted. It doesn't seem like there are, 10 plus assets that would be compelling to whitelist in the silo.
How would you whitelist further assets once the protocol is immutable?
You wouldn't.
Or are you
That's
saying
the
that
point. That's the point.
Yeah, I think what Austin or Guy is suggesting is that we pick them and that's it.
but inevitably some new thing is going to come along that everybody's going to want, whether it's in 6 months or a year or 5 years, it's going to happen. So then we have to fork the whole thing. Everybody have to migrate everything to the new Beanstalk.
Well, on the order of 5 years, yeah, definitely something to think about. Although that's, the time horizon on which, after these upgrades, that it seems like Beanstalk would be relatively set would be, call it a couple years. Now, if you're talking about before that, I guess I would challenge that there, a new very decentralized and liquid asset presents itself that doesn't exist today in the next year or so. But it's not impossible, I suppose. But just even theoretically, it's hard to imagine.
So let's play this out for a second. If that were to happen, how would you fork Beanstalk? Who would do that? So what entity would develop the changes? And then, where would the vote be to change the UI to point to the new contracts, contracts? Where would that take place? Or is the expectation that this new entity, maybe it's one of these private companies, they would develop that change and they would deploy new contracts and they would deploy a new UI and they would deploy a new DNS name?
I don't have answers to any of those questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess something else to think about as well is
they're not
the
bad
field.
questions.
Well, before we talk seriously about immutability, I think it'd be good to have all these things spelled out. That way people can get a clearer picture of like what that world looks like. Because it might be easy to like show the carrot and say like immutability is great, it makes everything safe, blah blah blah. But then once the reality of the implementation plays out, it could be a massive, part of my language, clusterfuck of like 5-10 different versions of Beanstalk with different UIs. The liquidity is just split among all of them. No one knows really which one's the right one or the correct version, or unless the stuff is figured out ahead of time and clearly laid out.
That's a really good point. As it becomes more and more immutable, it's more likely to follow the same sort of evolutionary path as Bitcoin, where there are all these different versions of Bitcoin, and I would hate to see that happen with Beanstalk.
Well, just to highlight again, the point of the roadmap pre, this discussion around removing governance is to make it such that if governance is to be removed, it is not compelling to go do that, because any upgrade to Beanstalk would be marginal, which again brings me back to the discussion around what include pre that removal. But, point taken. Don't think anything you said is inaccurate.
What does it mean technically to remove governance? Like there's no more voting for things? Or that you just set the ownership of the contract to a null address? Because it's one thing to make the
I'm not
contract
sure I
immutable,
understand
and
the question. I mean,
it's one thing to make the contract
from a
immutable.
technical perspective, it's the latter.
Sorry, the latter being.
The latter being transferring ownership of the contract to the null address. Now, if you're asking, is there going to be voting from a community social consent perspective on what to do with the DNS and some of these other things that you describe? Who knows? Maybe that's how it should work.
Well, isn't that governance?
I guess by the literal definition, yes, but because Beanstalk would be immutable, like Beanstalk would not have governance. Beanstalk, the smart contract.
Yeah, but Beanstalk is more than just a smart contract. So, like, if we say there's no governance, we're literally saying there's no more decisions for all of Beanstalk, not just the contracts. DNS, code, front end, UI, everything.
I think Albin here, when we talk about Beanstalk, we're only strictly talking about the smart contracts or just the protocol, not the things that are around it. I understand the importance of a UI. Yeah, maybe I'll explain now. I understand the importance of the UI and all of that, but it's not necessary or not fundamental to interact with the smart contract. So, people deciding and voting, and I'm not saying that this is what I think is to be done, or it makes sense to have governance to run a UI. But doing all of that things won't impact the protocol itself. I'm just saying that saying governance in my head is strictly only about smart contract changes, not the UI or the DNS and the things that are around it.
Yeah, I think that's a mistake.
If the community wants to continue to vote on the assets that you described, great.
Well, I think that's
It wouldn't be
I think
possible.
that's table stakes. That has to be voted. Someone has to own the DNS. Someone has to own and manage and maintain the front end. If a new Beanstalk app the contract is deployed when it forks, I think it goes without saying that the same DNS name in the app should point to the new contracts. If you're going to change the DNS name too, then frankly, that's a crazy idea.
I think you can take Liquidity as an example. So who manages, the liquidity.org front end, and then there are, different front ends, and there are still people who manage all of that, but the smart contracts are immutable. I have, we are all thinking together here about the idea of it being immutable. I'm just highlighting the point that, which is great that you're raising it. But in my head and in my definition, when we're talking about immutable, I'm only thinking about the smart contracts and not the surroundings.
Alrighty, I do have to run to my next one, but thank you everyone who surfaced questions and feedback. This is what it's about. Thanks everyone. Take it easy.
Thank you for running this guy. Have a great day.